Tonight, there's new video of what appears to be Nolan Wells and maybe the last image before his death after that 4th of July boat trip with friends in Mississippi. This video obtained by TMZ appears to show a man believed to be Nolan Wells on a boat during a large 4th of July gathering. The man in the video is wearing blue swim trunks similar to those seen in photos of Wells taken that day. Investigators say friends last saw Wells around 3 p.m., about 30 minutes after the video was recorded. Authorities say there's no indication of foul play, but a $125,000 reward is offered for information leading to an arrest and conviction in his death. Results from an independent autopsy commissioned by Wells's family are expected tomorrow.
A new piece of video has surfaced in this case. Footage that may be the last known image of Nolan Wells before he vanished. It doesn't show his face, and yet the person who filmed it felt strongly enough about what they'd captured that they walked it straight into the sheriff's office. At the same time, attorney Ben Crump has announced that preliminary findings from the independent autopsy, the one performed outside the state's own examination, will be made public within days, ahead of the state's own results. Tonight, we go through both, what this footage might actually tell investigators, and what a grand jury could eventually do with whatever this case ultimately produces. Since we last covered this case, a great deal has happened. This week, Nolan was laid to rest, with Reverend Sharpton officiating and Tyler Perry covering the cost of the service. Sharpton made a significant announcement during the funeral itself, which we'll get to shortly. We also know the FBI has become involved, specifically investigating threats made against people connected to this case, though the specific content of those threats and exactly who received them hasn't been made public. Nolan's phone remains with the family, and after they raised concerns that data may have been deleted from it, both sides agreed to a joint inspection, state investigators and the family's own experts examining the device together. A grand jury referral is still on the table, waiting for the underlying investigation to conclude, and 2 separate autopsies remain outstanding, the state's own examination and the independent one the family commissioned. That's the backdrop this new footage is landing against. It's worth pausing for a moment to appreciate just how many separate threads are now running simultaneously in this case. A federal threat investigation, a pending phone inspection involving 2 competing teams of experts, 2 autopsies moving on entirely different timelines, a funeral that's already come and gone, and now, on top of all of it, a piece of video that nobody had access to until this week. Any single one of these threads would be significant news on its own. Together, they represent a case that's accelerating rather than slowing down, even 16 days after Nolan was first reported missing. Just as this update was coming together, word arrived from Ben Crump's office that a press conference is scheduled for tomorrow, held alongside the Knox National Convention. According to the announcement, Crump will present the preliminary findings of the independent autopsy conducted on the family's behalf, arriving before the state's own results are public. That timing is worth sitting with. An independent pathologist's first priority in a situation like this is usually to check whether their findings line up with what the state medical examiner's office eventually reports. If they align, that's meaningful corroboration. If they diverge, that raises its own set of questions the family's team will likely want addressed directly with state investigators, and it may point toward additional testing or evidence that needs a closer look. It's also worth noting what this timing doesn't confirm. The state's toxicology results alone can take 4 to 8 weeks to come back, and there's no indication the independent examination has completed its own toxicology work in that same compressed window. So preliminary findings, whatever they show, are likely to be exactly that. Preliminary, not final, and not the whole picture. Investigators examining a case like this typically look first at what shows up microscopically in the lungs, whether there's fluid present, which would indicate Nolan was still breathing when he entered the water. That finding alone would shift the central question from what happened to him in the water toward what circumstances actually put him there. That's where toxicology becomes central, since it's the clearest indicator of what, if anything, was in his system at the time. It's worth being honest, too, about the limits of a preliminary finding delivered this quickly. Full toxicology work is genuinely slow because it has to be. Labs are testing for a wide range of substances, cross-checking results, and building a report that can hold up under real scrutiny later, potentially in front of a grand jury or in a courtroom. A preliminary announcement, arriving this early, is far more likely to speak to the kind of finding that can be established almost immediately upon physical examination, the presence or absence of certain visible or microscopic markers, rather than to a completed, comprehensive account of exactly what happened to Nolan in his final hours. That distinction matters because it's easy for a single word like preliminary to get lost in a headline, only for the fuller picture to look different once the complete report eventually arrives. Tomorrow's press conference could be the most significant development in this case since it began. Subscribe now, because we'll be covering those preliminary findings the moment they're actually announced, not the moment someone online guesses at them. Now to the footage itself. It was reportedly recorded on Horn Island at 2:23 in the afternoon on July 4th, and shown directly to the sheriff's office by the person who filmed it. In the video, a camera pans across a stretch of water crowded with boats and people. At one point, it catches a man standing on the back deck of a boat, bent over, reaching for something. His face is never visible. So why does anyone believe this is Nolan? According to the person who recorded it, the swim trunks the man is wearing match the color of the trunks Nolan is wearing in the now widely circulated July 4th photo with his friends. That's the entire basis for the identification. Not a face, not a name, a color match on a piece of clothing. If this is Nolan, it would represent the last known image of him before he disappeared and before his body was recovered days later, near the same stretch of coastline. It's worth being honest about how thin that identification actually is, on its face. A color match on swimwear, at a distance, from a panning shot capturing dozens of boats and people on a crowded holiday afternoon, is not the same as a confirmed identification. And yet the person who filmed it felt strongly enough about what they'd captured to walk it directly into the sheriff's office rather than simply post it online, which says something about their own confidence in what they believe they saw, even if that confidence alone doesn't settle the question for investigators. A homicide investigator and cold case consultant who reviewed the footage for this coverage laid out why a clip like this, even without a visible face, can carry real investigative weight. First, if authenticated, it establishes what investigators sometimes call proof of life, confirmation that Nolan was alive and active at a specific verifiable time. Metadata attached to the video can help pin down exactly when, and potentially, exactly where it was recorded. Second, the footage shows other boats nearby. That opens the door to pulling location data from those other vessels as well, which could help place Nolan within a broader, more precise picture of who else was in the area at that specific hour. And if he's the one reaching into a cooler or towards some object on that boat, it raises a very specific, answerable question: whose boat is that, and what's actually in it? That's the kind of detail that can be traced back to other activity earlier in the day and potentially cross-referenced against toxicology results once they're available. Third, and maybe most useful long-term, comparing GPS data from every boat visible in that footage against where Nolan's body was ultimately found could help investigators reconstruct the physical path between those 2 points, filling in exactly the kind of gap that's been missing from this case since the beginning. There's a broader principle at work in how investigators approach a piece of evidence like this, and it's worth spelling out. A single ambiguous clip, on its own, rarely solves anything. Its real value comes from what it can be cross-referenced against: other footage from the same afternoon, GPS records from nearby vessels, timestamps from cell towers, anything else that exists independently and can either support or undermine the working assumption that this is, in fact, Nolan. That's precisely why the sheriff's office has continued asking the public for any unedited photos or video from that day. Every additional piece, however small or seemingly unremarkable, adds another point of reference that this specific clip can be measured against. There's a timeline worth being precise about here. This footage was recorded at 2:23 p.m. Ben Crump has said Nolan was last seen on the island around 3 p.m., a detail that, as of this recording, hasn't been publicly contradicted. The boat carrying his friends is believed to have left the island around 4:31 p.m. without him. That leaves roughly a 2-hour window between this new footage and the moment that boat departed. It's also not yet confirmed whether the boat in this footage is even the same one his friends were on that day, or a different vessel entirely. Investigators would want to match the structure and manufacture of the boat in the video against the one in the earlier, more widely circulated photo to know for certain. There's also a forensic angle worth understanding. If the eventual autopsy shows evidence of trauma, defensive wounds, injuries to the neck, internal injuries, investigators would want to compare that against footage like this one. Time in open water naturally produces some abrasions from tide and current alone, so the absence of visible injury in a 2-hour-old clip isn't necessarily conclusive either way. But it's one more data point in a case that, until recently, has had very few of them. If this footage holds up as authentic and accurately identified, it supports the read that Nolan was simply enjoying an ordinary 4th of July on the water, with nothing outwardly alarming happening around him. Whatever changed between this moment and whatever ultimately happened to him becomes the specific window investigators need to explain. If footage like this exists, more of it likely does too, sitting on someone's phone, never submitted, because the person who has it isn't sure it matters. Subscribe now, because if that footage surfaces and changes this case, we'll have it covered the moment it's confirmed. Nolan's service was held July 20th at Centerpoint Church in Ocean Springs with hundreds in attendance. Amid remarks about who Nolan was, an athlete with real ambitions toward professional football, a role model to his younger siblings, Reverend Sharpton made an announcement that shifted the tone of the room. Speaking on behalf of the National Action Network, Sharpton pledged $50,000 as a reward for information leading to an arrest and conviction in Nolan's case. He was direct about the reasoning. Whatever the truth turns out to be, good or difficult, nobody intends to prejudge it. But the case cannot be allowed to end without the full facts being known. He said plainly that he doesn't believe Nolan was on that island alone, and that somebody, somewhere, saw or knows something. Moments later, in front of the gathered crowd, Sharpton read a message he'd just received from Tyler Perry, who had already covered the funeral's costs. Perry was pledging an additional $50,000, matching Sharpton's offer, bringing the total reward to $100,000 for anyone who comes forward with real information. A reward at that scale is a significant development on its own, and it's worth asking what it might actually do for an investigation like this one. According to the investigator we spoke with, a reward like this tends to work as something of a mixed tool. People with direct knowledge of serious wrongdoing, if that's what happened here, aren't typically motivated to come forward by money. Their reasons for staying silent usually run deeper than that. But a reward can meaningfully move a different kind of witness. Someone who already has relevant footage or information, wasn't sure it mattered, and simply never got around to turning it in. For that group, a public reward can be exactly the nudge needed. Across most of the cases this investigator has personally worked, though, reward funds haven't historically produced dramatic breakthroughs, which doesn't mean this one won't, only that it isn't a guarantee. It's also worth acknowledging plainly that a large public reward can invite a wave of unreliable tips alongside anything genuinely useful, false leads, misremembered details, or people simply hoping to cash in. Sorting through that noise becomes its own task for investigators, on top of everything else already on their plate. There's something worth sitting with about the moment this reward was actually announced. Not in a press release, not in a courtroom, but from the pulpit, at the end of a funeral, with Nolan's parents seated just feet away. Sharpton's announcement, and Perry's real-time response to it, turned a moment of pure grief into a moment of public action, almost without transition. That's not a criticism of either man. Both were, by every account, responding to genuine urgency and genuine love for a family they'd come to know through tragedy. But it does say something about the particular shape this case has taken. A private loss that has, at nearly every turn, required a public response in order to move forward at all. Nolan's phone remains one of the more genuinely puzzling pieces of evidence in this entire case. There are reasonable explanations for why a teenager might leave a phone behind while swimming. Nobody wants to risk a device in salt water. But that explanation sits awkwardly next to another detail. If Nolan had, as some accounts suggest, gone off to speak privately with someone, it's less obvious why he wouldn't have kept his phone with him for that conversation specifically. What's known is that the phone ended up with his friends, and the family later retrieved it and found location data through a tracking app that didn't match what they expected. There's also the family's stated belief that data may have been deleted from the device before it reached them, which is exactly why both sides agreed to a joint, simultaneous examination, state investigators and the family's own experts working from the same data at the same time. The investigator we spoke with called the phone a genuinely interesting piece of evidence, specifically because of what he described as a shift in behavior it seems to represent. A young man who leaves his device behind while swimming is one thing. A young man who apparently intended to return to a specific boat and simply never showed up while his phone sat there the whole time is something else, a detail worth running down carefully once the joint inspection actually happens, since the GPS history and broader data footprint on that device could meaningfully narrow the timeline that's still missing from this case. There's also a simpler, more human way to think about this same detail. For most people Nolan's age, a phone isn't just a device, it's the primary record of an entire day, automatically generated without anyone having to think about it. Location history, message timestamps, app activity, all of it accumulating quietly in the background, regardless of what the person carrying it is actually doing. That's precisely why investigators have treated this specific object with so much attention. It has the potential to answer questions that no witness, however well-intentioned, can answer with the same precision. Questions about exactly where Nolan was and exactly when, independent of anyone's memory of that day. Once that joint phone inspection actually happens, it could be the single most important update in this entire case. Subscribe now, because we'll bring you what it actually shows, verified, the moment it's confirmed. The investigator we spoke with also walked through, in general terms, how cases built around water deaths like this one typically get approached. A significant part of the work involves establishing what he described as the victim's pattern of life, who Nolan actually was, day to day. By every account gathered so far, that picture is consistent. An involved, well-liked young man, close with friends, succeeding academically and athletically, without any indication of the kind of personal risk factors investigators sometimes look for in cases like this. That consistency matters because it shifts the analytical focus outward, toward the risk factors present around him rather than within his own choices or circumstances. In broad, hypothetical terms, investigators in a case like this typically have to consider a range of possible scenarios. A genuine accident with no other person involved, some kind of dispute or physical altercation, whether serious or the kind of horseplay that can escalate unintentionally among a group of young people, or something more deliberate. Each of those scenarios leaves different physical evidence behind, which is exactly why the secondary autopsy matters so much. Signs like internal bleeding, defensive wounds, or head trauma could help investigators distinguish between an accidental drowning and something that involved another person directly. The investigator was careful to frame all of this as the general range of possibilities any competent investigation would need to methodically rule in or out, not as a conclusion about what actually happened here, which remains genuinely unknown. It's worth emphasizing that framing again, because it's easy for a list of hypothetical scenarios to start sounding like an accusation if it's repeated without that context attached every time. Investigators build these kinds of frameworks specifically because they don't yet know which scenario, if any, fits the actual evidence. Laying out the range isn't the same as suggesting any one possibility is more likely than another. It's simply the methodical, unglamorous work of making sure every plausible explanation gets checked against whatever physical and digital evidence this case ultimately produces, rather than assuming the first explanation offered is automatically the correct one. According to Ben Crump, The district attorney's office has indicated that once the underlying investigation concludes, this case could be presented to a grand jury for potential criminal charges. What those charges might actually be remains entirely unknown at this stage. It's genuinely too early to say. The investigator offered some useful context here, drawing on cases with similar shapes he's personally worked. In one case, he described what began as a disappearance off a boat eventually unraveled once investigators found physical evidence contradicting a witness's account, revealing an altercation that had been concealed from the start. The broader point wasn't about predicting an outcome for Nolan's case specifically. It was that timelines and witness statements that don't line up are often exactly what pushes an investigation from an assumed accident towards something requiring much closer scrutiny. If Jackson County's investigation does eventually produce evidence supporting criminal charges, those charges could take a range of forms depending on what's actually found. Anything from charges connected to withholding information from investigators to more serious charges if evidence of an altercation or intentional harm emerges. Right now, none of that is confirmed. What is confirmed is that the door to a grand jury referral remains open, and that the investigation itself, in the words of the analyst who walked us through all of this, remains genuinely fluid. It's worth remembering what a grand jury actually is, and isn't in this context, since the phrase tends to get treated as more dramatic than the underlying mechanism actually is. A grand jury doesn't determine guilt. It reviews whatever evidence prosecutors present and decides only whether that evidence is sufficient to bring formal charges at all. That's a meaningfully lower bar than a conviction, and a meaningfully different process than a trial. Whatever a grand jury eventually decides in this case, if it convenes at all, would represent only the very beginning of a much longer legal process, not an ending, and not, by itself, an answer to what actually happened to Nolan Wells. So here's where this update leaves things. A new piece of video, possibly the last image of Nolan alive, is now in investigators' hands. Unverified as to identity, but potentially useful regardless, for pinning down a timeline that's had very few fixed points until now. A reward of $100,000 is now on the table, funded by two men who never knew Nolan personally, but were moved enough by his story to put real money behind finding answers. A joint examination of his phone is still pending. 2 autopsies remain outstanding, with preliminary findings from the independent one expected within days, and a grand jury referral remains a real possibility, contingent entirely on where the underlying investigation actually leads. None of that adds up to a resolution. What it adds up to is a case with more fixed points than it had even a week ago, video with a timestamp, funding for information that might otherwise have stayed silent, and forensic and digital evidence still working its way through the process that will eventually have to explain how an ordinary holiday afternoon on the water ended the way it did. There's a particular kind of progress that doesn't look like progress from the outside, and it's worth naming before we close tonight. Nothing covered in this update actually tells us what happened to Nolan Wells. Not the video, not the reward, not the pending phone inspection, not the possibility of a grand jury. But each of these threads narrows the range of what's still unknown, just slightly, in a way that pure speculation never manages to do. That's a slower, less satisfying kind of movement than a clean answer would be. It's also the only kind of movement that actually holds up once real scrutiny gets applied to it. We'll be following tomorrow's press conference closely, along with the phone inspection and both autopsy results, and we'll bring you what's actually confirmed the moment it's confirmed. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next update.